Today's video is going to be about basics. Like, where do I start? I want to make a simple quilt. What do I need to do to start? That's a question I get a lot with people who come through the store who either have made a quilt but didn't necessarily know what they were doing, or they want to make a quilt and don't know where to start. The thing that I hear a lot is, I don't have time to learn, and I get that and I respect that, because quilting is definitely a time thing. It is also a mental health thing, I think, so I try to carve out time for the thing that makes my brain happy. So if you want to learn how to quilt, rest assured there are ways to do things that aren't super time consuming. The other thing I hear a lot is that I'm just not patient enough to quilt. DJ laughs every time somebody says that to me, because I am not a patient person. I want to do it right, and I want to do it effectively and quickly, because I want to move on to the next thing. Okay, most of the people I know who quilt are not the most patient people I've ever met. And the reason I know that that's true is because we have invented, quilters have invented every tool possible to make it go faster, to make it more accurate, and to make it more appealing and relaxing for our brain. This is the project we're going to do. This pattern is called Nightlight by Villa Rosa Designs. The fabric line is by Lewis and Irene, and it's the Tom 10 Christmas collection, Tom 10 Village Christmas. It's a super cute quilt. We're going to learn things like fussy cutting. So we're going to fussy cut these pictures right here off of a panel. We are going to learn how to cut our pieces straight, strip set, cut strip sets, and then join our strip sets to each other and then to the blocks next to it. This is a perfect beginner quilt for someone who hasn't done quilting before. I like a strip set because the idea of cutting apart all of these little squares and then sewing them back together individually is kind of like, yeah, I don't like that. I'm going to show you how to do strip sets. Whenever I'm teaching new quilters, I teach them what I call the holy trinity of quilting. If you can master these three things, then you are well on your way of becoming a master quilter. If you can learn to cut straight, sew with a scant 1/4 inch, and press with intention, those three things, cutting, sewing, pressing. Those three things are going to give you the accuracy and the detail that you want and that you need to have good, accurate patchwork. That is all the skill that you need for this quilt here, okay? And I'm going to give you some tips and tricks to get you those three things. Just remember the holy trinity: cutting, piecing, pressing. The first thing we're going to talk about is fussy cutting. We're going to cut these little squares apart right here. So this kit that we're starting off with has a panel in it. The panel is 1 yard big, and there's a bunch of 5-inch squares. Now you can either get a 5-inch ruler to cut your squares down with, but I'm going to show you how to do it with a ruler that's slightly larger. So this ruler is 8 inches. The solid lines are 1 inch. The dotted lines are 1/2 inch. We're going to cut these squares down to 5 inches because that's pretty much the size that they are. Now here's the thing: when you're working with panels, panels don't necessarily get printed perfectly straight because they're fabric, and fabric is fluid, and fabric moves. Don't freak out about that. The reason I chose this panel was because there's a nice dark buffer line around it. So even if you don't cut this perfectly straight, you still don't have like a weird, like a white background out here. So you've got plenty of room to get around that square. However, if we cut this to a 5-inch square, we're not gonna probably need really any of that outside bit. I'm gonna use my lines, my 5-inch lines. Here's a 5-inch line and here's a 5-inch line. And I'm gonna line that up with the square that's printed on the panel. Now what we did was we just went and rough cut the panel apart because we knew we had plenty of room for seam allowance around here. So I just took my rotary cutter and we cut the panel apart. But now we wanna get to where we're cutting accurately. So I'm gonna line my 5-inch line up with the inside of that square. Cut away the outside of the top and the right. Then we're going to spin this around. Now I'm only going to cut 2 sides at a time. And see how we got a little bit of the dark blue over here? It doesn't matter because it's well within that 1/4 inch seam allowance that we're going to sew, so you're not going to see it anyway. Then I'm going to take the 5-inch line and the 5-inch line again, and now it's easier to see because the fabric is so much darker than my cutting mat, that when I line up the 5-inch line here and the 5-inch line here, we're going to get a perfect square. Cut the right and the top again, and now what we have is a 5-inch square. Okay, that's pretty easy. This is pretty simple, straightforward, fussy cutting, but that is the way that you cut a square out of an existing piece of fabric. I'm going to do it again. We have one more here. All right, so now first step is done. We have cut our blocks apart. Now, when we're cutting strips, this is the part that people get really freaked out about. When we're cutting strips, have you ever taken a piece of fabric and cut it and you have that weird elbow? I'm going to show you how to not get that elbow. This is a piece of fabric. It's selvage to selvage, so I've got the whole width of my fabric. I'm going to choose one side. This is my selvage. This is my cut side. I'm going to pick a side. I'm going to put a little nick in the selvage. Okay, so now there's that little nick. I'm going to rip this all the way along the edge of the cut piece of fabric. When you're ripping, don't rip like this. Don't stretch it side to side. Rip away from your body. So pull one hand toward you and one hand away from you. Oh, good. I was hoping it would do that. See how it ripped off the edge? This is why we rip fabric, because we want to see where the straight of grain is. This whole piece looked straight, but it wasn't, because again, fabric is fluid, and as it goes onto the bolt, it kind of wiggles around, and so when we cut it with a rotary cutter off of the bolt, it's not straight. So since I started ripping on that side and it broke, I'm going to start ripping on this side, because most of the time this gives you a perfect strip. And now what we have is a nice straight side to our fabric. Now, why do you think that this is more straight than it was before? Fabric is woven. You have threads that go right to left and threads that go up and down, essentially, and they weave together like this. If you can take one thread and pull it all the way up the length of your fabric is straight. If you rip your fabric and you have a little bit of wave here, just take it over to the iron and press it. It's okay. Here's another hot tip when you're working with getting your fabric straight. My selvages are not straight. Selvages aren't straight. That's just the nature of the beast. They do what they want. They have their own weird little parties, okay? You can see here, this is not straight. My selvage isn't straight over here, but the part that I've ripped is straight. This is the part we care about. Let the selvage do what it wants. It's gonna party, let it party. Don't try to control it. So we're gonna match up this side that we ripped. We're gonna ignore the bad behavior of our selvage because it doesn't matter. And then I'm gonna take my piece of fabric and I'm gonna fold it back up again. If there's any threads, go ahead and pull them off. There's always gonna be one or two, and that's okay too. And I'm gonna make this super obvious because I want you to see the point. One thing I see where people really struggle to get a straight cut is that they want so badly for this fold to match up with these selvages. It's not going to. Let go of that control issue. It is not going to happen. Stop trying to make it happen, okay? It's not going to happen. So what you do want to happen, though, is you want to match up this ripped side. Now I have 4 layers of fabric here. Here's my selvage, here's my selvage, here's my fold, okay? I've got a nice, usable, flat piece of fabric now. Isn't this pleasing? We're all very happy about it. Yes, I ripped this. However, I am not going to assume that this is going to be the side that I want to sew with. You always want to sew on 4 cut edges, all right? Now, here's the secret to getting a good cut without an elbow. You'll see, let me zoom in here. You'll see on my ruler that, again, this ruler has solid lines on the 1 inch, dotted lines on the 1/2 inch. I usually take my 1/2 inch line because I can see through the dots, and I line that up with the fold. And I've got just enough fabric out here that I want to cut it away, all right? You never cut toward your body, ever. You always cut away from yourself. The only place I want to look at my ruler is right down here where this dotted line is. And I am simply going to cut off this little bit of fabric on the end and get rid of that. Now, after we've done those things, we are ready to cut our strips, all right? So the pattern tells me what size strips to cut and how many to cut. Okay, so I took the pattern a little step further. The pattern has solid squares and then only 2 colors to make this patchwork here. I gave you 3 colors. I gave you white and 2 different colors of blue, and I crisscrossed them so that they go this way and this way, which I thought was just kind of fun. You can do it however you want to, though. So we're going to cut our strips. Our pattern tells us what size to cut our strips at. Since this is a cutting demo, I'm going to cut mine 2.5 inches because that's a pretty common size to have for strip sets. I'm going to do the same thing I did just a minute ago, where I line my ruler up on my fold. Since I know that this line over here is freshly cut and it's nice and straight, I'm going to line up my dotted line on my fold and my 2.5 inch line out here on this piece, on the side that we just cut nice and straight. And I'm going to cut a strip. I'm going to slide this away because I want to make sure that I have a clean cut before I pick up my ruler. Do yourself a favor and get in that habit of sliding your piece of fabric away before you pick up your ruler, because if you pick up your ruler, it's really hard to go back and cut through a spot that you missed. Okay, so I'm just going to cut the number of strips that I need, which is 3. Now, if you line your ruler up like this and you see that this isn't straight, do yourself a favor and straighten up the side again and then start cutting your strips. Now, I want to show you, because we did those couple of things. 1, we ripped. 2, we straightened up our side. 3, we used our ruler along the fold. So now when I unfold my piece of fabric, look, there's one fold, no elbow. And here's the middle fold, no elbow. See how perfectly straight that is? Next, we're going to talk piecing. So I have 2 strips that are ready for my quilt that I'm going to go and join together. This is a white on white fabric, so it has a really subtle print to it. The side that you can feel the ink to is the right side. So make sure you're always matching up pretty sides. I don't pin when I sew strip sets. I find that it just becomes problematic. I'm going to take this over to the machine. I'm going to show you some tips for getting a scant 1/4 inch. But if you've cut your strips right, you should be able to line them up with each other. I can't see my blue fabric from through my white, and if I flip it over, I can't see my white fabric past my blue. That means they're cut straight. My first tip for getting a scant 1/4 inch is use a 1/4 inch piecing foot with a guide. I'm going to come over to my setting on my machine. I have it set as a middle stitch, and then I'm going to bump, so that's where my needle starts out to begin with. I'm going to bump my needle over 1 to the right. Okay, so what that does is it just bounces that needle over just enough this way to give you the scant 1/4 inch. So scant means just slightly less than. It's sort of like when you're baking, and some old-fashioned recipes will call for a scant cup of flour, which is a cup minus a tablespoon. So it's really just taking away this much. And the reason you want to do that is going to become evident in the pressing. My preferred needle is a microtex needle. I use it most of the time because then I don't really have to think about it. Most of the time, I have a size 70 microtex needle on my machine. The reason I use a size 70 needle is because I use a size 50 thread. So I have size 50 2600 gray Aurifil thread in my machine, in my top and in my bobbin. That's kind of my go-to thread. The color kind of goes with everything, and as long as you have good tension in your machine, you shouldn't really have to worry about matching the thread perfectly. Now, I wouldn't be using black thread and white fabric because you're going to see a shadow, but that gray seems to work really well. All right, so I've got my 2 pieces right sides together. Notice I haven't cut my selvage off. That's going to happen in the next step. And we just want to line our fabric up really straight. That's another one of those things that you'll just get to where you know when it's right. But in the meantime, take your time, go slow, make sure everything's lined up before you go very far. I'm using my 1/4 inch piecing foot. So see how my fabric is riding right along that line. It's not buckling, it's not tilted this way, and there's no gap. It's going to ride right along that line. If your machine has a needle down option, that is very handy when you're doing patchwork. What that will do is when you stop sewing, your needle will stop down. That keeps you from slipping away from it. So as you're sewing, you're going to take a few stitches, you're going to go a little ways, and then when you stop, and I usually go, 3 or 4 inches or so, and then I adjust my fabric to make sure that everything's lined up. Take your time in this process because you do not want a skinny seam allowance for so many reasons. 1, you can't line it up with the next thing if you have a skinny seam allowance. 2, as you start washing the quilt and it starts getting use and love, that skinny seam allowance is not going to hold up in the laundry. It's not going to hold up as the dog is laying on it. It's not going to hold up as the kid drags it around the house. So having a good solid 1/4 inch seam allowance is very important in quilting for many reasons. The first reason is that your math works, but then long term, the reason is that your quilt will hold up. Okay, so here's to the pressing with intention part. What I mean by pressing with intention. Pressing is a skill, and one of the things that people don't realize when they learn how to quilt is that you press as much as you sew. So just tell yourself, sew a seam, press a seam, sew a seam, press a seam, sew a seam, press a seam. It's how it goes. So if you sew this whole seam, guess what you're going to do next? You're going to press this whole seam. You cannot skip this part. When I get quilts in to be quilted, I can tell if you didn't do this part. The pressing is just as important as the sewing. So here's my favorite tips about pressing for beginners. You want an iron with some weight to it. We are not pressing shirts, so we're not pressing back and forth and pushing really hard. We're not ironing, we're pressing, okay? So the weight of my iron is very important because it is going to do the work for me. If I have to push down on my iron to get my seam flat, it's going to distort the fabric because the pushing down, the weight of your arm and the back and forth friction is going to stretch your fabric out, and then you're going to be unhappy. I'm just going to fold this in half, cut along the fold, and we're going to press both of these. Before you press the seam, set the seam. So take your iron and just slowly and without pushing on it, iron the seam closed. Okay. Now, we as quilters like to press to the dark side, and no, I don't mean that as a Star Trek joke. I mean a Star Wars joke. I normally do mean Star Wars jokes, but not today. Whatever fabric is facing up is the fabric you're going to press toward. So if you have the option of pressing toward the darker piece of fabric, that is usually best practice. The reason for that is you don't see, so if you press it toward the light fabric, you can see the shadow through it. If you press it toward the dark fabric hides the shadow. The shadow knows. So you're going to set your seam flat. And then here's the trick. Pick up your top piece of fabric, and just with the weight of your iron, you'll notice I am not pulling anything. I'm not even going to put my hand under there. I am just going to use the weight of my iron to press this seam up. Not only is it straight, but it's all going toward the dark fabric. All right. Now, there is some controversy in the quilting world about steam or no steam. I am a huge fan of steam, so long as you use it right. With great power comes great responsibility. Steam is a responsibility. Okay. The reason I like the iron that I have is because it gives me a lot of steam. You'll see that as I'm pressing this, I am not going back and forth. I'm not even ironing the whole piece of fabric. I am just ironing the seam. Okay. Now, since I did steam on it this time, look at how much flatter that is. Steam becomes problematic when you're working with bias, or if you're just pressing the hell out of it. You don't need to. And especially if you have a good iron with weight, you don't need to press it to death. Okay? So we're going to take both of these pieces of fabrics that we pressed, and now I'm going to show you a trick for cutting strip sets. Since we're making 4 patches, what we need is 2 sets of the exact same fabric. And so since I cut this in half, it's going to work really great. Okay. So I have 2 strip sets. I'm going to take my sets and lay them on top of each other. Now remember, we didn't cut our selvages off. So we want to make sure that we're not putting our selvage into our strip set. Literally, I'm going to take these 2 pieces of fabric, and since we pressed them away from each other, they're going to nest right together. If I run my hand down the seam, I can feel where right here it starts to go sideways, and you can see that it's not straight up here because you can see the blue fabric. If I rock those together and I sort of roll my fingers down the seam, I can feel that everything is only one layer. This is what we want. So just like when we put our strip sets together, if I flip this over, I shouldn't be able to see the fabric underneath, and I can't. Now we're going to cut these puppies apart. So I have come back to my cutting table. Everything's laying nice and flat. I'm going to use, this is my favorite size ruler for most things. This is a 6x12 ruler. This is my go-to. This is what I teach most of my new quilters with. I'm going to line up a solid line along my seam line. This way I know that this way is straight. So I'm lining up my solid line with a seam line, and I'm going to cut off this edge over here because these are my selvage pieces and I don't want those wrapped up in my quilt. Okay, so we're going to get rid of that. Now, you notice we put these pieces of fabric together, so we've got 2 layers. Hot tip with making 4 patches. Whatever size I cut these strips is the width I'm going to cut my my strip sets apart. The same width applies. That's how I get squares, right? So we cut these 2 3/4. So we're going to take our ruler again, and I'm going to line up a line with my seam this way. And then I'm going to line up this side with the size strip that I need. Then I'm simply going to cut that apart. So now what I have is my strip sets are already lined up. My seams are going opposite each other, which means when I take this to the machine, this is all going to line up. I will put a pin through the seam like that. Note the head of my pin is out of the way. The tip of my pin is more than 1/4 inch from the end. Now, if you're confident you can get away with that, you can only pin it right there. If you're nervous and you're not sure that you can trust yourself to carry this from here to the machine, then you can put a pin here and here. You want this to happen right here. There it is. These should be kissing each other, and they should be perfectly flat, just like that. Okay, so I'm going to take my whole strip set here, and I'm going to cut these apart and make the rest of my blocks. Okay, now another tip that I like is I string piece everything. Yeah, I know I need my steps, but I would rather string piece everything and walk to the iron once than do a bunch of individual pieces. I also don't cut my thread in between my pieces. Even though my machine will do that, I don't. I strip piece it. That's why, or string piece it. That's why I like having my pivot feature, because my machine, the foot will pick up and my needle will stay down, which means I can just put my next piece in there. Now we've got our needle setting the same as we did before. I've got my 1/4 inch foot on, and my needle is over 1 to the right, because I still want a scant 1/4 inch here. Okay, so I am going to piece these all together, and I'm not going to cut the thread in between. The other thing I want you to pay attention to is all of my blocks are pinned in the same direction. I am sewing, all of them have the blue one here and the white one here. That's important because then your 4 patches are in the same pattern. Okay, so now when I get to the end, I'm going to cut this and I'm going to take it out. And what you'll see is that all of my pieces are lined up the same. All my pieces are still stuck together by a string. Okay, this is one of my favorite tools. I call it the Quilters Ninja Star. It has an old rotary blade in it, a used rotary blade, and then it sets inside this thing so that you can just pop your stitches in between. Here's another tip for pressing. If you line your pieces up to press them the same way, so let's say you have something in, for whatever reason it looks like that. This is going to make you crazy when you go to put it together later. So if you just line them all up like this, when you go to press them, they'll all be pressed the same direction. So I make a stack, set my seam just like we did when we did our strip set. Use the weight of your iron to press your block open. Okay, now what I would like to point out about all of those things that we just did is look at that perfect intersection. This is what you're going for all of the time in quilting. That perfect intersection. There's no gap, there's no overlay, there's no weirdness. Okay, so we're going to press all of our units just like that. All right, now I'm going to use my pattern to lay out the pieces that I need to finish my rows. Okay, now I've already put together most of the quilt, and I'm going to show it to you in just a second. But the way the pattern goes is it's a dark block, a printed block, a light block, a dark block. That's the way I changed the pattern to give it this other kind of fun feel. The picture in the pattern is slightly different. Did you see how I turned it this way but they're not going the same way, pay attention to that. So as you're laying these out, I made these go opposite just for fun. It doesn't have to be like that. You put yours together any way you like. But that, I just thought that was kind of fun. Because this way it makes a white path this way, and a blue path this way, and a blue path that way. This should be the finish to our layout. And we're going to start sewing these together. So I'm going to sew one row together at a time. Here's the way I like to take things to my machine when I'm putting everything together. This has an odd number of blocks. So when I'm putting stuff together, I like to take the whole row to the machine at once. So what I'll do is I'll flip this over and I'll put this block to this block. I always put a pin in, like I showed before, where the pin is out of the way and the pointy end is pointing toward the way that I want to sew it. So if I was to just stack all of these up and take them to the machine, any 4 of these sides could be the seam that I want to do. I have screwed myself up multiple times. I point my pin toward the side of what I want to sew. So now I'm going to take these to my machine, and just like I showed you with everything else, I'm going to sew a scant 1/4 inch down this side, and I will be back. Like I said before, sew a seam, press a seam, sew a seam, press a seam. If you sew it, you must press it. So I'm going to, just like I did before, I'm going to keep all my blocks stacked going the same direction. If you take this is another pressing with intention step. If you press everything the same way, it's going to go together better. So I tend to, when I'm joining blocks, press toward the side that's either dark or that has the least amount of patchwork in it. So since I've already got a seam here, but I have no seam on this block, I'm going to press towards this block. And with this particular pattern, since every other block is a solid block, your pieces are all going to nest really nicely, and you'll see that when we join our rows together. Okay, so here's how we had our row laid out before, right? And we had that other one at the end. So if I take this block and I put it on top here like this, and I pin it, and then I take this one, because this one is going to go here, right? Now here's another little tip. I'm going to pin this one just because it was the one that was smaller. The other reason that I like to put my pins where I'm going to put them is if I pin it here and then I decide to sew from this side, my pin is not in the way. Okay, I'm going to sew these together, and I'm going to put the whole row together, and then I'm going to show you how to join 2 rows to each other. Now I've got my 2 rows all put together. They're all pressed toward these solid blocks. That's important because watch this. When I flip this over, see how my rows alternate? A solid block in each one. When I flip this over and match these up, look at how my seams all butt together. This is why we press to one side instead of open, because when you press it this way, look at how they click together. So I'm going to match up every seam where there is a solid block and a patchwork block. You can match up the ends and pin that too if you need to. Again, you can't pin too much, but you can pin not enough. Every one of these seams is going to go away from each other, so they're going to kiss. And I'm going to sew this seam, and then I'm going to come back and show you how to press a long seam. Okay, now I have my 2 pieces joined together, the seams along this side. We are still going to set our seam. So do you feel like you have a little bit more of a handle on how to get good patchwork? Maybe you've been quilting for years and you picked up a new trick. Maybe we demystified it for you just a little bit. Okay, so let's talk about the things that are available so that you can build up your tool stash. The first thing we have is the finished kit, not finished, the kit to make this quilt. So this is the Nightlight quilt that uses the Tom 10 fabric, and it has all these adorable little winter scenes with gnomes and forest animals. The fabrics that are in the blocks are a white on white swirl. There's the little blue gnomes, and then there's the dark blue trees. This is a great beginner project. Then we talked about the importance of having a nice square ruler. This is a 6.5 by 6.5 inch square Quilter Select ruler. This is the size I usually recommend for new quilters to start out with a square. As you're making bigger blocks, you'll want a bigger square. I usually recommend the 6.5 first and the 12.5 next, because the 12.5 will cut most size blocks of quilts that you're gonna make. This is the Quilter Select 45mm rotary cutter. This is what I use most of the time. If you find that you're struggling to push through your fabric, this is a really nice cutter because it's metal and it's heavy. The other thing I talked about a lot today was my iron. I really love this iron. This is the Reliable Velocity Steam Iron. This is the model number 230IR. It's the one that has 2 heat settings, makes lots of steam. It is an investment, but it is worth it. I also talked about my favorite size needles that I sew with the most. These are Microtex size 70. I like this when I'm using my 50 weight Aurifil thread. The eye is just the right size. It is sharper than most needles, so it doesn't make as big of a hole, and you don't have, you have less runs in your fabric from using a Microtex needle. The thread, which I pulled right out of my machine, this is the 50 weight Aurifil in color 2600, which is Dove. This is kind of my go-to color because it's kind of a chameleon kind of thread that goes with everything. If you're new to sewing, or even if you're not, you're gonna need a seam ripper at one point or another. It just happens. You can't help it. This is my preferred seam ripper because it has 2 sizes. One side is thick and one side is thin. Also, this little rubbery end, when you take your stitches out, you rub the little rubber end on, and it's like an eraser, and it pulls the little threads away. And last but not least is my handy blade saver cutter, which I also showed you how to use. This comes apart. It stores for, it goes together either for storage or for travel. There's little magnets inside there that lock it up like that. So that's pretty handy and cute. Plus, kind of makes you feel like you've got a ninja throwing star in your sewing room, because I mean, who doesn't want that? I hope you learned some new tricks. I hope if you were a little bit afraid of starting to quilt, or if you're a new quilter, that these things were helping you out. I know this is a longer video than usual, but there was lots to talk about. Okay, so watch this as many times as you need to. Fast forward to the stuff that you care about, and pick yourself up this kit. It's a really easy one to get started on. So I will see you later. Bye.